days so far. That's thanks entirely to the excellent contributions that you all have brought to us. I'm very, very grateful for that. But somehow, despite having a great couple of days, for some reason I couldn't sleep last night. Maybe it was all the talk of violence and war. Maybe it was coffee with dinner. That seems likely. Maybe it was the barking dog down the street at 2:30 in the morning. I'm not just sure. Whatever the reason, I got up. Sorry. That's live. Are we live? Hey, good. All right. Now I don't have to yell. So whatever the reason for my sleeplessness, I got up and did a little reading, as one does. And I opened something titled, "On Killing the Red Cross," which seems like a pretty interesting title. Now, you might expect that the piece criticized killing the Red Cross, but you would be wrong. It actually defends the view that members of the Red Cross can be legitimate targets in war. Not surprisingly, this did not help my sleeplessness. The author of my bedtime reading is our speaker this morning, Helen Frowe, senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Kent and research associate at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. And my sense is that the piece I was reading in the night captures something very powerful in her work. Helen does not tread lightly on settled orthodoxies. She has an incredibly incisive mind and goes right to the difficult points, refusing to shy away from, shall we say, the sensitive implications of her views. The result of this penetrating and bold thinking is that Helen has had a major impact on scholarship in the ethics of war in a remarkably short time. As I get older, I increasingly look to Moses for inspiration. It's not too late to make a difference in the world, I say to myself. After all, at 50, Moses was an obscure shepherd. Helen is clearly following a different model, David Hume perhaps, lighting the philosophical world on fire right from the start of her career. Just 5 years out from her PhD, Helen has over a dozen articles and invited reviews, published or forthcoming. She has one book out, the very highly regarded The Ethics of War and Peace and Introduction, and another under contract, Defensive Killing, an Essay on War and Self-Defense. And she has two co-edited volumes forthcoming, How We Fight, Ethics in War with Gerald Lang, and the Oxford Handbook of the Ethics of War with Seth Lazar. This is remarkable productivity with work of the highest caliber. It's hard to imagine the impact Helen will have had by the time she's the age of Moses confronting Pharaoh. So please welcome Helen Frowe.
Wow, this is inevitably going to be disappointing now, but you'll have to blame Chris for that. Thank you so much for getting up so early, and thank you so much to Chris and to the rest of the committee for organizing such a great conference. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days. I'm afraid I'm one of those just war theorists that Michael Walzer objects to so much. I think that the moral rules of war are reducible to the moral relationships between individuals, and as will be obvious once the paper gets underway, I'm also a big fan of hypothetical cases, especially when you illustrate them with little stick figures. Now, this paper doesn't offer a general defense of this broad approach to just war theory, and it doesn't offer a defense of the methodology that people like me employ either. Rather, what I want to do is defend my approach to war, this kind of reductive individualist view, against a specific objection to it that's been raised recently by David Rodin. And we can call this the conditional aggression objection. So conditional aggression is military aggression by one state towards another that's going to become violent only if it's resisted. So imagine that France takes a fancy to the Basque region in Spain. it wants to have political and territorial control of the Basque. So it sends its soldiers to occupy this region and to make it sufficiently secure that the happy transition to becoming part of France can begin. Now, the French have no particular desire to harm any of the Basque population and will not use any kind of force against them unless, of course, Spain decides to resist the invasion. Now, it's widely accepted that in the circumstances that I've just described, Spain would have a just cause for a defensive war against France. But some just war theorists have argued that a reductive individualist account of the sort that I defend and that Jeff McMahon defends can't allow that threats to political goods alone can provide a just cause for war. So in this paper, I explore this argument and I suggest some possible replies to it. Now, one popular explanation of why war would be a proportionate response to the French aggression that I've just described is that the goods that are directly threatened by the invasion, so those of political and territorial control, do themselves warrant protection by lethal force. So it's not only life and limb, we might think, that can be protected by military means. Other important goods, such as sovereignty, can also warrant this kind of defense. But, as David Roden has argued, this seems to pose a problem for a new breed of just war theorists, these people that we can call reductive individualists or reductivists for short. Now, according to reductivists, have I gone? I've gone. Why have I gone? Where have I gone? Oh. Yeah, it's had enough. It's a collectivist.
Helen, try hitting that switch again because it went out on me yesterday. It just timed out.
Okay, no? Ooh. Okay. Is there a switch on this one as well? Sorry. Oh, it's gone off again.
Obviously, the peaceniks around here.
It's the Red Cross again. Okay. No, we've gone again. I'm sorry.
This is PMA. Let's see if this works.
There we go. Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. I will not be silenced. So these people that we call reductivists, they think that the moral rules that govern killing in war are simply the rules that govern killing between individuals, most obviously the rules of self-defense and other defense. So reductivists reject the more traditional view of just war that holds that war is an essentially collective political enterprise which is irreducible to the relations between individuals. Now, Roden argues that when it comes to self-defense amongst individuals, lethal force is a proportionate response only to threats to vital interests. So an individual may kill to defend herself against very serious harms, such as death, torture, slavery, and rape, but she may not kill to defend her lesser interests, which for Roden includes property and other resources, and political rights like the right to vote. So she may not, for example, kill a person who deliberately prevents her from voting on election day, perhaps by damaging her only means of transport to the polling station. Even though this person violates her right to vote, the right to vote is a lesser interest, insufficiently important to warrant lethal defense. Now, if this is true for individuals, then Roden argues reductivists must grant that it applies at the national level as well. If no single member of the polity may kill to defend her democratic rights, then the polity as a whole cannot kill to defend those rights. Now, according to Roden, the only way to explain why something like sovereignty warrants lethal protection is to attribute some kind of inherent value to the state or to the political community in a way that seems inimical to the reductivist view. So thus, it looks like the reductivist is committed to saying that the right of political integrity cannot be defended by means of war, since war nearly always involves inflicting lethal harms and therefore will be disproportionate. And the same will go for the defence of ownership of territory or resources. Unless one thinks that an individual may kill to defend her property, one cannot grant individual members of states the right to lethally defend land or resources. If an aggressor threatens only these goods and has no plans to kill or enslave or otherwise seriously harm the citizens unless they resist, Roden argues that reductivism requires capitulation, since military force would be a disproportionate response to this purely political aggression. Moreover, he argues that this is correct, that it would indeed be impermissible for a state to try to protect these political goods by means of war. So, according to Roden, it's only genocidal aggression, aggression that directly threatens the vital interests of citizens, including their rights against enslavement and displacement, that may be resisted. So we end up with this kind of division between lesser and vital interests. So we have vital interests, which includes death, amputation, rape, torture, indefinite displacement, enslavement, and also, he says, causing a state to descend into anarchy, because that renders citizens stateless. And then you have these lesser interests, which are political goods, property, resources. And then we get these two types of aggression that piggyback on top of these categories of lesser and vital interests. So Roden says that if aggression directly threatens vital interests, so if the invader is trying to kill or enslave or displace the population, then that counts as genocidal aggression. So he's got an expanded notion of genocidal aggression. He's not using it just for sort of the kind of ethnic cleansing that's about trying to eradicate a group. He has a broader idea of what could count as genocidal, and it's any kind of invasion that directly threatens the vital interests of a population. And then we also have what he calls political aggression, which is aggression that threatens lesser interests. So Roden argues that political aggression and genocidal aggression have, and the quote is up on the slide, I think, have a fundamentally different moral structure. Resistance to political aggression will typically produce greater loss to vital interests among individuals within the defended group compared with engaging in no defence at all. And he adds that this observation, that resistance would cause greater harm to vital interests than capitulation, is in fact the defining feature of political aggression. So his claim is really that if you resist political aggression, you make yourself worse off than if you just capitulate it. So he thinks it's irrational to resist these kinds of political aggression, and also morally wrong. Now, a natural response to this kind of argument is to point out that the members of a state who are faced with merely political aggression need not make immediate recourse to all-out war. Rather, we might say, look, you can engage in more limited acts of resistance, such as reinforcing your borders, moving your troops to the borders, refusing to cooperate, and so on. And we might say that surely this kind of non-violent response is not disproportionate to the threat that the citizens face to their political interests. And should the aggressor state respond violently, well then the vital interests of the citizens are directly threatened, and then it looks like forceful resistance will be a proportionate defence of those vital interests. So the idea is that by working in stages, using only proportionate force at each stage, it seems like the victim state can permissibly escalate the situation until lethal force becomes a proportionate response. But Roden argues that this reply fails because any calculation about the proportionality of non-violent resistance must take into account the harms that the victim state foresees will be inflicted by the aggressor in response. Now, he illustrates this idea with a case which we can call hair. So that's you're the stick figure. Now, you know that if you tease the sensitive bald guy about his hair, he's going to flip out and kill some people. But you go ahead and you tease him about his hair. And as predicted, he pulls out a gun and then he shoots people. Now, let's take a quick show of hands. Who thinks it would be wrong to tease the bald guy because of the harms he'll then cause? So not just because teasing's bad and you shouldn't laugh at people because they're bald. Who thinks that it would be wrong to tease the bald guy, really, really wrong, in virtue of the fact that you know that then he's going to kill people? Okay. Sorry? It's not question time yet. Okay. So, I'd say that was probably maybe about 3/4, 2/3, 3/4 think that it would be wrong. Now, this isn't a case in which you're defending yourself, but still we can see the general point that Rodin's trying to make, that you need to think about the harms that the sensitive bald guy is going to inflict when you're thinking about what to do. Now, Rodin grants that the harms that the bald guy is going to inflict don't count as much for proportionality as harms that you would directly inflict yourself, right? So it's not equivalent to harms that you directly inflict yourself. But the fact that the foreseen harms will arise through the bald guy's intervening agency doesn't make them irrelevant to what you're permitted to do. On the contrary, they make teasing the bald guy a very, very bad thing to do. Whereas absent these predicted harms, you know, it would be a bit mean. But it's not dreadful, right? But it seems like in this case, the fact that you foresee what he's going to do if you tease him makes it really dreadful if you tease him. So, Rodin argues that whilst harms that one foresees will arise from someone else's intervention are discounted, right? They don't count as much as the harm that you might directly inflict yourself. They're not discounted to zero. They still matter for determining what one is permitted to do. Now, in the next section of the paper, I identify what seem to me to be some internal difficulties with Rodin's particular account of this problem. Now, these difficulties suggest that we should be cautious about employing the categories of political and genocidal aggression, and I think the underpinning categories of vital and lesser interests. In sections 3 and 4, I consider two possible responses by the reductivist to the general problem of conditional aggression. The first is to suggest that, contra Rodin, political interests can warrant defense by lethal force. Now, this could be because they're vital interests after all, or it could be because it can be proportionate to lethally defend lesser interests when there's a sufficient number of lesser but still important interests at stake. And again, I suggest that this result should make us skeptical of the value of this distinction between vital and lesser interests. The second response that I explore focuses on the role of third parties in resistance. So, Rodin illustrates the wrongness of resisting a conditional threat using the familiar highwayman's challenge of your money or your life. So here the direct threat is to a lesser interest, your money, and the conditional threat, which backs it up if you don't comply, is to a vital interest, your life. Now, Rodin says that you ought to hand over your money rather than resist if you know that by resisting you're going to escalate the threat until you need to kill the highwayman to save your life. Since the good that's directly threatened is a lesser interest, it's just money, it would be disproportionate to try to protect it in a way that will ultimately end up endangering vital interests. But, as I want to argue, Rodin also seems to be committed to requiring people to capitulate to direct threats to their vital interests. And this is implausible, and I think it undermines his conceptions of political and genocidal aggression. So, if we think about a case that I've called rape. So, angry rapist tries to rape Alice. If Alice fends him off, he'll be so angry that he'll go and rape 2 other women. If Alice kills angry rapist's friend will go and rape 2 other women. Who thinks that Alice may resist the rape despite the fact she foresees that if she does so, other women will be raped? Okay, so that's about half. So less enthusiastic for Alice, but, you know, she's not completely lost. So this is a case where we've got a direct threat to Alice's vital interest, which is backed by a conditional threat of harm to other people's vital interests. Now, Alice can foresee that serious harms will result from her defensive actions, but it really seems to me implausible to think that she may not resist the rape. So I'm with the eyes. It seems to me wrong to say that she would have to submit, because otherwise angry rapist or his friend is going to rape other people. And I think these kind of intuitions probably generalize quite easily. So if a man, for example, has an opportunity to escape a racist mob who plan to lynch him, I doubt that many people would require him to stay put if the mob's anger at his escape would drive them to lynch 2 other people. If this is right, then there would be something worrying about a view that held that one must capitulate to direct threats to vital interests if they're backed by conditional threats of greater harm to others. But the problem for Rodin is that his account does seem to require capitulation in these cases. So given his claim that, quote, the morality of resisting the direct threat component of a conditional attack cannot be determined independently of the conditional threat, we can't just stipulate in advance that vital interests always or even usually warrant defense by lethal force, irrespective of the consequences. It's an upshot of Rodin's view of proportionality that whether or not the defense of interest warrants lethal force will depend on what the aggressor has threatened to do if the vital interest is defended. And indeed, in conversation, Rodin has endorsed this position, arguing that Alice is required to submit to the rape if doing so stops her attacker from going on to rape a significantly greater number of women, even though he himself identifies rape as a harm to a vital interest. But once we apply Rodin's account of permissible resistance or impermissible resistance to the defense of vital interests, I think it's going to make it impermissible in some cases to resist even genocidal aggression, as well as political aggression. So imagine that we've got an aggressive state, and it's demanding the execution of all the members of a small ethnic minority group that live in the victim state. Now, say that the ethnic minority group has 1,000 members. If the victim state doesn't kill all of these 1,000 people, then the aggressor is going to invade. Assume that the invasion will result in more harm overall to vital interests than capitulation would bring. So let's say that in the event of an invasion, 100 of the minority group would be killed, but 1,100 other serious harms would befall other people. So it would befall their defenders and also non-combatants on both sides of the conflict. So let's say that we get a total of 1,200 people suffering serious setbacks to their vital interests if the victim state decides not to capitulate. Now, what Rodin's going to say about this case depends on how he's identifying the relevant group, harms to which we have to factor into our proportionality calculation. His definitions of political aggression and genocidal aggression are tied to thoughts about the harms that will befall the group being defended. So he speaks of the defended population, those very people whom the defensive action is intended to defend, and the defended group. The question then is whether these references to populations and groups are meant to pick out all members of the victim state, or just the subgroup whose interests are directly threatened by the aggressor state, so in my case, the members of the ethnic minority. If the group being defended is meant to be synonymous with all members of the state, this gives us the result that the aggression I've just described is political. Fewer vital interests will be harmed overall if the victim state capitulates and executes the minority group, because then only 1,000 people will die, as opposed to 1,200 that will die in the invasion. And Rodin points to that being the defining characteristic of political aggression, the fact that fewer vital interests will be harmed overall if you capitulate. So resistance against this aggression will be impermissible on his view. Now that result seems to me to be wrong, both in its denial that the threat to the minority group is genocidal, this seems to me clearly a genocidal threat, and its pronouncement that the victim state ought to execute the group rather than defend them. So I should think that Rodin's going to want to go the other way and say that when he talks about references to the group being defended, this isn't meant to be synonymous with all members of the victim state, but rather can refer to a subgroup within that state, such as my ethnic minority group. So he tells us that an aggression is political and should not be resisted if resisting it causes more harm to the vital interests of those very people whom the defensive action is intended to defend. Now, since in my example, resisting will be less harmful to the vital interests of the minority group, only 100 of them will die if you resist, Rodin can count the threat as genocidal. But this result isn't just semantic in Rodin's view, it's normative, right? It tells us that the invasion can be resisted because it's genocidal, and that seems right. But this is still a case in which more harm will befall vital interests overall if the invasion is resisted, and that was meant to be the definition of political aggression. So we've got two problems. One is that this case seems to defy categorization on Rodin's account, and that problem comes from his reliance on vital interests and the number of vital interests that are going to be harmed to define what it is for something to be political aggression. So that seems to me to be a mistake. The other problem is it looks like the only way in which Rodin can explain why it's permissible to resist this aggression is if he ignores the harms that are going to befall people who are not members of the minority group, right? He has to discount completely the harms that are going to befall people in the aggressor state and other people in the victim state. But then we really need an argument for why the interests of those people just don't seem to matter for the purposes of judging whether resistance is permissible. So I think this case identifies a basic incoherency in Rodin's account because it can't pronounce on whether or not this is a case of genocidal or political aggression, and thus on whether it may be resisted. And this suggests to me that thinking about the number of vital interests that will be harmed through resistance isn't going to enable us to distinguish between political and genocidal aggression. More generally, I'm pretty skeptical about the value of this distinction between vital and lesser interests. So Jeff McMahon suggests that lesser interests just are those interests that don't warrant protection by lethal force. Now, certainly it seems correct that an individual cannot kill a person who damages her car and thereby prevents her from voting, right? So if you slash my tires and I can't get to the polling station, I can't kill you, all right? That would be bad. Even if by killing you somehow I could then get to the polling station. Maybe I can take your car then. Now, the putative worry for the reductive individualist is that it looks like they can't invoke the natural response of saying, oh, but the numbers matter. An aggressive occupation impedes lots of people's rights to vote because they're meant to be all about the individual. But I think this is a bit of a non-worry. It doesn't follow from the fact that it would be disproportionate to lethally defend one person's lesser interest, that it must be disproportionate to lethally defend many people's lesser interests. There's nothing in reductivism that prohibits caring about numbers. The central claim of reductivism is that the moral rules of war are the moral rules of ordinary life, and aggregation is certainly a familiar feature of morality in ordinary life. Most people accept this when it comes to protecting vital interests. So part of the explanation of why most people think it's permissible to kill the one to save the five in the trolley problem is surely that one is saving 5 lives at the cost of 1, right? So it's not like people who are reductivists can't think that numbers matter. Now, of course, the trolley problem is a case in which one's harming a vital interest in order to protect other vital interests, right? So you sacrifice one person's life in order to defend other people's lives. So it doesn't follow from thinking about cases like the trolley problem that one could harm a vital interest to protect lesser interests. But I think it's nonetheless true. One can sometimes harm a vital interest to protect a sufficient number of lesser interests. So if you're going to say culpably break my arm, it would be disproportionate to kill you to stop you from doing that. But surely there comes a point at which if killing you is the only way I can stop you going around breaking lots of people's arms, everybody's arms that you can find, everyone you come across, you just have to have a go at breaking their arm. It really seems that at some point it would be proportionate to kill you to stop you if that's the only way in which we could stop you. I don't think there's anything in this claim that's unfriendly to a reductivist, because aggregation and other defense are familiar parts of ordinary morality. But I think the numbers are significant when it comes to political rights, not merely for straightforward aggregative reasons, but because increasing the numbers produces a step change in what threatens each individual. If you damage my car and prevent me from voting, it won't really make any difference to the sort of country I live in. But imagine that measures are taken before a UK election to ensure that anyone living outside of London is unable to vote. This would do much more than frustrate each individual non-Londoner's right to vote. It would not simply be a case of iterating the same harm of vote prevention across many individuals. Rather, increasing the numbers would affect a change in the sort of harm being perpetrated against each individual, because it would change the UK from a legitimate democratic state to an illegitimate dictatorship. States coercively impose legal frameworks upon their citizens. Whichever government is elected by the Londoners and then attempts to rule over the whole of the UK will be imposing this framework illegally, unjustly coercing individuals to adhere to it. This is a much more serious wronging of each individual citizen than the wrong of preventing any one individual from voting. Now, views like Rodin's seem most plausible when we consider a scenario in which a state suffers some kind of political coup, but nobody really gets hurt. So, for example, we can perhaps ask what the people in the UK ought to do if the London elected government is a nice government. What if they change very little, so that in fact the change in the electorate hardly makes any difference to the lives of people in the UK? So you've kind of had a change of management, is the idea, but nothing else really changes. In this scenario, would it be permissible for the non-Londoners to nevertheless protest against the regime? I think the answer to this question is yes, but that it's also a redundant question, because the nice government scenario almost in principle cannot obtain. And to see this, we need to spell out what would happen in the event of resistance to this illegitimate but nice state. So let's say that the non-Londoners decide to object to the new order. So maybe they all go on strike and they go and stand outside the Houses of Parliament and they politely make their unhappiness known. Now, if the government is indeed nice, then presumably they will respond to this pressure non-violently. They'll realise the error of their ways, they'll cede to the reasonable demands of the non-Londoners, dissolve the illegitimate parliament and hold new elections under the old system. But then the resistance that's employed by the non-Londoners seems perfectly proportionate to the wrong being done to them, and their actions seem perfectly permissible. The trickier situation is that in which it turns out the government actually isn't nice after all. And let's say that the non-Londoners sort of know this. They've probably managed to infer it from the way the government has replaced their legitimate democracy with an illegitimate dictatorship. Given this, the non-Londoners predict that any resistance on their part will be violently met. But then we need to notice that the scenario we imagined above, where the government is nice and very little changes in the UK as a result of the new electorate, and in which violent resistance might have seemed disproportionate, bears no relation to how things are going to be in a state that's subjected to political aggression that is backed by conditional threats to life and limb. The new government is not nice. Rather, it threatens to quash legitimate and reasonable dissent with violence. And things are therefore very different in Britain, inevitably so, because now the securities that guarantee our current way of life are gone. Instead, we live in a country where laws are illegally enforced upon us, backed by the threat of unjust violence if we don't comply. Existing under this kind of regime of state terror is likely to be pretty grim. And it's grim even if people don't resist, because living under the threat of these sorts of reprisals is to live in general conditions of fear and mistrust, of the sort that usually accompany states that are prepared to violently put down dissenters. And this is kind of what related to what Duncan said yesterday, that the conditions of ongoing fear and threat are transformative for a society. And I think that for people who are used to living in liberal democracies, it's easy to underestimate the importance of the kinds of protection that have vanished in the state that I've described. But having legally protected recourse in the event of unjust treatment by the government and its agents is a substantial good. And it seems to me that not living in a state of perpetual oppression and fear is a pretty vital interest. Should it count as a vital interest in Rodin's sense? Well, it's not as important as not being killed. But then nobody thinks that all vital interests are equally important. Being displaced is not as bad as being enslaved. Being raped is not as bad as being killed or being subjected to certain forms of torture. But these things are bad enough that most people think one can kill to avoid them. Rodin himself suggests that an invasion that causes a state to descend into anarchy counts as threatening vital interests because it effectively renders the citizen stateless, which he thinks is a very serious wrong. If that's true, it's not a huge leap to think that turning citizens' legitimate democracy into an illegitimate dictatorship, that backs its commands with the threat of violence is also to threaten citizens' vital interests. But once we explicitly recognize that there are degrees of importance within the category of vital interests, that it can be disproportionate to defend a vital interest with lethal force, that lesser interests can aggregate until they warrant lethal protection, and that what began as lesser interests can also become vital interests, it's not clear to me why we should retain these categories of vital and lesser interests at all. Telling me that something is a lesser interest or a vital interest doesn't tell me much about what can be done in its defense, so the distinction to me seems to lack any normative force. And as I suggested above, the fact that resistance endangers more vital interests than capitulation doesn't determine whether or not an invasion is political or genocidal. So the following section of the paper, which is the last section, is a bit more kind of exploratory and indicative. I'm going to say some stuff that seems to be true about resistance, but I don't spell out fully the implications for war, partly for constraints of time, but also because I'm not really sure what they are yet. So think about the following case. So this is I want to think about third parties and resistance. So Victor steals Helen's chocolate bar, and Helen tries to wrestle it back. And then we get this kind of undignified struggle. But then Victor tries to strangle Helen. But there's a third party, Seth, and Seth's observing the situation. Seth has got a gun, and he can kill Victor to save Helen's life. Now, it seems to me that it would be permissible for Seth to kill Victor and impermissible for him to kill Helen. Even if Helen acts wrongly in refusing to capitulate to Victor, right, even if she ought to hand over the Mars bar, it's not as if a third party couldn't possibly distinguish between the morality of their actions. Victor is guilty of a much more serious wrong, that of unjustly threatening Helen's life, whereas Helen is guilty of disproportionate defense that is rendered disproportionate only by Victor's wrongful intervening agency. Victor's wrongdoing makes him liable to be killed, whereas Helen's does not. And I think that this is still true, even if Helen predicted that Victor would react violently to her resistance. Her behavior might be worse in this scenario, but it still seems that the third party would be permitted to assist her. And it's worth noticing that this is true, even when Helen refuses to surrender a trivial good like a chocolate bar. It still seems to me that third parties could come in and defend Helen, but they couldn't help Victor out. Now, this suggests that even when someone wrongly resists aggression, others can have permissions of other defense to assist in that resistance. And if it doesn't follow from the fact that Helen ought not to resist, that Seth may not assist her, then it doesn't follow from the fact that my co-citizens ought not to resist political aggression, that I may not assist them if they nonetheless choose to resist. And this raises interesting questions about the moral status of that kind of defensive war, and the moral status of those who are permissibly assisting it. And I don't have the space to say much about that here, but I'd be interested in the Q&A in people's thoughts on the permissibility of assisting this kind of resistance, where the initial resistance you might even agree is wrongful, but it still seems to me like third parties would be allowed to help you out. Now, of course, things are complicated in war by the prospect of harm to bystanders. So imagine that I threaten to throw a grenade into the audience if any of you laugh at my paper. Careful. Now, it's probably true that under these circumstances, nobody should laugh at my paper. But what if Mark sees that Chris is about to laugh? Is Chris morally responsible for endangering the lives of the audience? Well, I think he probably is, because he foresees what will happen if he laughs, and he has a reasonable opportunity to avoid endangering the audience. Not laughing will not be terribly costly for him. But even if Chris renders himself liable to be killed by Mark in virtue of the fact that he's responsible for endangering all of your lives, it still seems to me that if he can, Mark should kill me to stop me from throwing the grenade rather than kill Chris to stop Chris from laughing. Now, I think that the requirement to kill me instead of Chris perhaps can be explained as an extension of the necessity principle which attaches to defensive action. The necessity principle is grounded in the idea that it's wrong to cause unnecessary harm. Now, it seems plausible to think that causing unnecessary harm gets morally worse, the less morally culpable the target of force is. So killing Chris would be instrumental in averting the threat to the audience, right? It's one way to stop me from throwing the grenade is to kill Chris before he laughs. But it's not strictly necessary because there is an alternative, killing me. And it seems like that alternative is morally preferable because I'm fully culpable. And this seems especially true when the extent to which Chris's action is wrongful comes from my wrongful response to his laughter, right? So his responsibility supervenes, if you like, on my culpability. So even though Chris's resistance to my coercion through his laughter is wrongful, and it does endanger bystanders, it looks like third parties are still permitted to kill the aggressor to save the resister's life. But then what if, by killing me, Mark will also endanger bystanders? Well, then I think he needs to weigh up the risk to the bystanders against the significance of the rights that I'm threatening and the number of people whose rights are at risk. And if we're talking about resisting an aggressive war, then, as I've argued, the rights violations are not only widespread but significant. In addition, anyone considering aiding the resistance must take into account the fact that if others are resisting, then there's going to be a war. So the choice is no longer that between the harms that will befall innocent people if the state capitulates versus the harms that will result from the war. Now it's a choice between aiding a defensive war that's going to happen, that aims at protecting important rights, or failing to do so. The more important the rights and the more people whose rights are at risk, the more harm it will be proportionate to risk to innocent people in protecting those rights. The kinds of rights that are threatened by even merely political aggression seem to me to be sufficiently important to warrant endangering the lives of at least some innocent people. So, reductive individualists still have a lot of work to do when it comes to explaining central features of jus ad bellum. It's certainly a feature of the individualist body of literature that it's focused almost exclusively on jus in bello issues, stuff about combatant equality, stuff about the moral status of non-combatants. And we have a lot more that we need to do to show that we can talk not just about killing in war, but actually war as a project, the whole enterprise of war. But I do think that this particular challenge, that only by granting the state inherent value can it be proportionate to defend the state against political aggression, fails. What political invasions threaten to do to each individual is a very serious violation of their rights. And since reductivists can care about numbers, they can care about the fact that such an invasion seriously wrongs a great many people. I also think we should reject the suggested dichotomy between vital and lesser interests in favour of a more nuanced approach to proportionality. The question of assisting resistance also raises interesting questions that suggest that the impermissibility of resistance in the face of conditional violence might be less straightforward than cases like the highwayman suggest. One's obligations once others engage in resistance might not be the same as one's obligations in the face of the initial political threat. Thank you.